talk about what happens when you receive feedback on your animation. Sometimes the notes are small and easy to accomplish. Sometimes they're larger and require you to really adjust a certain part of your animation. And other times, unfortunately, the note is to change the whole shot. Those are probably the least fun, but they often result in some of the best changes to your work. Now, as for the feedback you're going to get and the size of those notes, when you're given a small change, for example, if I point over here and I'm told, oh, hey, do the Disney point, the two-finger Disneyland point, which, fun fact, if you haven't been to Disneyland, no one who works there is allowed to point with one finger. They have to point with two fingers. That new pose is going to affect the surrounding fingers. It might adjust the wrist a little bit. Things like that are not too difficult, and those are the best kind of notes to receive. But often the changes become a bit larger. If it's not just the pose of pointing, but it's, I want to have the character from the arm over here, we got to change the arc, we got to change the timing, we have to change the spacing, we have to change something about an actual action where there's motion involved. Depending on your workflow and the way you've built your shot, that could be easy to accomplish or that could be kind of a pain. The more keys you have, the more controls you're using, the deeper you are into your shot, the harder those kinds of things are to fix. I see a lot of people who are really resistant to deleting keyframes in general. They always want to try and rework, adjust, maybe add more keys to try and get that thing in there. Sometimes it's not a bad idea to delete stuff. If you are constantly trying to rework existing animation, you're trying to take one thing and shape it into another, sometimes that can just take more time than just redoing that section. But my tip for you is to do bookends. The idea is, with whatever we need to adjust, if I need to adjust, for example, the height of this jump, I'm told, hey, the character needs to go much higher. I'm going to go ahead and open my graph editor, Animation Editor's graph editor, and just put that over here. If I need to change the height of a jump, with this particular rig, I need to grab the IK feet and the IK hips. And usually the way I work is pretty sparse in terms of keyframes. I don't have too many keys, because I can see the top of the hips and I can see the tops of the feet. They're a little bit delayed, but overall, I know what my curves are doing. I'm very heavily using the graph editor, and so it's easy for me to come in here and make adjustments because I know what these splines represent. The more familiar you are with things like the graph editor, the easier changes like this might be. But you might not be a graph editor animator. You might be more pose-based. You might use layers. There's many ways to go about this process. But to do the bookend trick, I can go to a frame where everything is good. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit S, I'm set a key. In fact, sometimes it's safer to take everything and set a full key on the whole animation, on the whole character, on that frame, so that everything is locked down on frame 58. I can move ahead to wherever the character lands, which I'm going to call frame 73, set a full key. I've now just bookended that section. I have full keys that preserve anything on the outside of this range. Within those two bookends, I can do whatever I need to do. I will have to be mindful of kind of how I blend in and out of these changes, just so that nothing feels too jarring once we enter this new range. But I should be free to delete keys and make adjustments without too much consequence. So if I filter by the up and the down, I do have a lot of keys here. I can technically come in here and blow away all these keys. I'll get rid of this one and then all of this before he hits the ground. This one, and that one. I don't think that's really gonna help me because I got rid of a lot of useful information, but technically I could come and make the character go much higher, and then eventually his feet, I might also want to be a little bit higher. And there's other things I need to play with. I'll make these adjustments without setting additional keys a lot of the time. I'll just start moving things around and I'll workshop it. So the bookends are really useful for when you're using things like the graph editor and you want to adjust your animation in the viewport, in the graph editor, however you choose to do it. But another technique for these smaller changes is animation layers. I can take, for example, the feet once again and the body, the hips, these three in particular, because these are the things that cause the character to move around through the scene. If I leave out the feet, they just stay there. So I need to make sure I don't leave them out, I bring them with me. I'm gonna go to my animation layers over here on the right, and I can say layers, create layer from selected. That now creates a new animation layer that put those three objects in, and they're ready to animate on top of my original data. So I'm going to lock what's called the base animation. The base animation, you can see all my keyframes down here, they're grayed out. That's all my normal data, all my animation that's pre-existing, everything I've done. And now I have a brand new layer with no keyframes that those three controls only can be animated within. If I try to grab something else like the head and set a key, it'll give me a little error and say, that's not in the layer and the base animation is locked. You can't key that. And so I have to just make sure that when I do this, that's why I did the create layer from selected. But once that's done, I can take my 3 objects here, and I'm going to once again bookend. I'm going to take the 3 from maybe here, because the feet are on the ground. So I'll hit S, I'll set a key. That's, maybe I'll do it on 59 actually. Because 59, the feet are right off the ground, sure. Up into the air, and then there, we're trying to make contact with the floor. I've got my bookends, and right here in the middle, I'll just say, up you go. Now all I've done is I've done this adjustment to the height, which if I go ahead back into my graph editor, you can see that I have all this grayed out animation because in my base animation layer, everything's still there, it's just not accessible because I locked it. In this new layer, I have a fresh set of curves. Go to Translate Y, I can adjust my hang time, I can maybe change the ease on this a little bit. He now goes much, much higher with this layer. And what's cool about this is if I give this to the director, the supervisor, my client, you wanted it bigger? Here it is. And they go, it's too much. This is really nice because animation layers, I have a slider. I can just dial this back, 50% of that change. There you go, done. Notes completed. So there are different ways to address notes. And in something like this, where it's about the height or about the pose, I can make these kinds of changes really easily with something like animation layers. And the bookend trick works whether or not I'm using that, just to kind of preserve anything outside of the bounds that I'm trying to adjust. If I want to just mute this layer, I can turn it off so we don't see the change anymore. I can also delete this if I'm not happy with it, or I can merge it back down and combine it into the final animation if I want to keep it. I'll just delete it, go back to normal, and I'll unlock my base animation so everything is back to normal. Now, let's say that I'm given feedback on this dive, which I was. I showed this to a friend who has a more realistic visual effects background, and his feedback was that little jump at the end is a little springy, it's a little cartoony. Could we see it maybe with like a scramble? What do? I would do the same thing. I would find a nice frame like this where the character's kind of in a point where we can create an alternate timeline. We can branch off and do something different. I'm gonna grab all the controls, and you can see in this particular case, I've got keys on every single frame. We're not gonna worry too much about that, but I would pick the frame, 88, I'm gonna set a full key, I hit S, I key everything. And to be really careful, I'll also click the little bookmark button, and I'll leave a little note for myself on frame 88. So now I can see right here in the timeline, this orange thing. That just tells me which frame I have done my bookend on. I'll move forward until we are maybe in the down position. I'll leave myself another bookmark. I should also set my full key there. And now I can see, great, in between here and here, fair game. So I will narrow my focus, jump to 88, jump into here. And now this is the range that I want to adjust. Instead of springing up into the air, I need to animate a scramble. Now there's not time for me to completely animate this whole thing before your eyes right now. It takes some time. But what I can show you is the first step. What I would do immediately, I would save this as a new version of the file, just so I don't screw up my old file. I can always come back to this. But first thing I'm going to try is just say, you know what? Let's just start fresh. Take everything in between my bookmarks, delete. We're not starting over, we're starting again with experience. We can add specific poses if we know what they're going to be. We can just kind of layer in pieces that we think might feel kind of good. We can go look at reference, create new planning for this little part of the animation and kind of Frankenstein it in there. There are a lot of different ways to go about this process, but the first step is to not be afraid of deleting our work. Before I delete, in general, in the graph editor, you can do what's called buffer curves. Buffer curves are awesome. So if I have some rotation animation, in fact, let me just do this with one curve so we can really focus our attention. If I grab the hips, and I bring this up, and I look at the translates and the rotates. I will switch my view mode to normalized, just so I can show you the curves a little bit easier. Here's all the animation data we have for this section. This represents the hips jumping into the air. And you can see the little jump right here in this green one. Rather than just blowing it all away off the bat, I'm going to select these curves, and I'm going to come up to this button up here. It'll look like nothing happened. You can click it as much as you want, nothing's going to visually change. The only thing I want to make sure I have is under View, I want to make sure I have Show Buffer Curves turned on. Instead of I need to make sure that's checked. Because what will happen now is if I move one of these curves, I can see kind of the ghostly outline of where it was. See that little outline? So now I can make adjustments, I can delete, add keys, I can just say goodbye, whoop, and they're gone. But when I select that curve, I can see what it used to do, right? You can see what it used to have. And so if I ever need to reconstruct anything, it's pretty easy to just kind of match the old ghost. Or better yet, I can just select that curve and click the button next to the one I had hit before, and that'll swap. It jumps back to what it was before, and what I had adjusted now becomes the buffer curve ghost, and I can just switch back and forth. So what I'd like you to do at this point, hopefully you have something that you've animated in the past, doesn't matter if it's body mechanics, acting, could be anything. Change something. Practice the process of making an adjustment, small, medium, and large. If you have the time to do all three, I'd recommend it. At the very least, try small and large. I'd like you to try making these adjustments in whatever way works best with your workflow. If you're working in Blender, you don't have animation layers. Only Maya has those at the moment. So you can use the bookends, you can adjust your splines, you can adjust your poses, you could try the animation layers workflow, or if you're reworking the whole shot, you might just go back to the drawing board for that one particular part. New reference, new planning, different workflow, try some stuff. And I'll meet you in the next lesson where we get into some techniques for large animation changes.